Hey print friends, quick update before we start this episode. Since it was first published in July 2019, my guest has chosen the name Opal Deruvo. As you'll hear, they are referred to as their previous name in this recording. This has been left with the artist's consent. Okay, enjoy.
But yeah, that these are very real, very programmed ways that we're limiting the number of images that we're, the types of images that we're able to see. And so that visual artists have a way to kind of push back against that because we're, our life is the images we make.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 18th episode of Pine Copper Line, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release an episode every 2 weeks, and on the off weeks, I publish an article on the Pine Copper Line website featuring images and maybe a bit more information about the artist I'm going to interview. Just a quick round of housekeeping before we jump in this week. I have a couple of exciting things on the horizon, and I don't want you to miss out on them. First, I'm getting tantalizingly close to reaching 15,000 followers on Instagram, at which point I'm going to be doing another giveaway, and this time it's a stunning etching by an as-yet-to-be-named but incredible Thai printmaker. You're not going to want to miss this, so make sure you're following the PCL Instagram if you're not already. Second, on the 31st of this month, it's July 2019 for anyone who's counting, the call for the Megalo International Print Prize is going to close. Now, I don't know if you know about this call for entries yet, but Megalo is a great print studio in Canberra, Australia, and every year they host a print prize, for which first place gets, drumroll, $12,000. There are also 4-figure prizes for all other placements. I'll put a link in the show notes for how to enter. But prizes aside, just by getting accepted, you'll be exhibited among other incredible printmakers from around the world at their gallery. I gave a little tour of last year's exhibition over on Instagram, and it was a goddamn inspiration. Finally, huge thank you to all the Patreon supporters who help bring this show to you every 2 weeks. Honest to goodness, I couldn't do it without you. You are the very best, my heroes, and thoughts of you are keeping me warm in these long, cold Sydney winters. So, as always, printmaking forever, shun the non-believers, join the party. Okay, print friends, do I have an episode for you? What you are about to treat your ears to is an excerpt from a 5-hour conversation I had with my guest, Opal Deruvo. Paul has an incredible story to tell about being introduced to the Center for Contemporary Printmaking at the tender age of 14, and how from there they've developed their practice into a diverse and beautiful body of work, exploring critical queer moments with the reverence of an 18th century portrait. I don't even want to say more about it than that. You're just going to have to go on this ride yourself. So sit back, relax, and prepare to fall madly in love with Opal Deruvo. Hey Paul, how's it going?
Hi, Miranda.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
It's great to see you. I'm so excited to be here.
I know. I feel like we have amazing things to chat about, and I'm really looking forward to it. But let's see, before we dive into all of the juicy questions, would you just introduce yourself for the audience?
My name is Opal Deruvo. I'm a non-binary artist and printmaker working in Norwalk, Connecticut as a collaborative printer and studio manager at the Center for Contemporary Printmaking. The print shop that I work at, the Center for Contemporary Printmaking, is in my hometown, which led up to how at 14 I walked into my first print shop, the CCP. My jaw dropped and I really fell in love with the environment, and I started as an apprentice there. So it's really the shop that I work at now is the first print studio I ever walked into.
So how did you come to even walk into the shop?
So I grew up pretty much in a family of artists. My mother's a preschool teacher, and my father was a darkroom photographer and a photography teacher. So I grew up around darkroom photography, and it had a real impact on my practice. There was just such an aesthetic to the work that he did, and the way that he taught the process, which was deeply connected as far as a really alchemical craft, which he was an amazing instructor for. I'd always been making artwork, as so many of us had, but I really struggled with translating things into two dimension. So I started drawing using wire and making sort of two-dimensional wire sculptures that I could manipulate by hand. And so it was a short jump from there to start thinking about brushing ink over the wire, and then like oil-based ink, and then running it through a cold mount press that was a sort of spring-loaded, low-pressure printing press. And so I started using that to make these wire prints, and also had heard about Degas' process for making reductive monotypes, and tried to replicate that on dampened watercolor paper in my father's darkroom studio in our basement on a cold mount press, which to varying degrees of success. And then at the time I went to a school that was focused on Japanese studies, and my grandmother saw a listing in the paper for a show of woodcuts by an artist, Randy Bull, who was having a retrospective. I thought it was just a gallery that I was walking into, but when I got there and started looking around, I realized that the Center for Contemporary Printmaking had 10 etching presses, facilities for all of the traditional printmaking processes. And I just wanted to come back, and I pretty much told them that if they didn't find something for me to do, I was just going to follow them around. So if they could either give me a broom, or I would just sort of come and walk around the studios. And at the time, the master printer there was Anthony Kirk, who is a master printer and etcher who had worked with Ken Tyler at Tyler Graphics. So he had, 30, 40 years of experience by the time that I was there. And so I really got to see right away what level printmaking could be brought to. One of the things that I loved about it was seeing that there was a profession that, printmaker had an ER at the end of it. It was something that you learned and you also could do. So I was always influenced by knowing that I wanted to learn craft and the technique of it. And it meant that there was something that really left me with some creative freedom for the work that I wanted to make, knowing that it wasn't about what I wanted to make, it was about how well I could make it, as far as the profession was concerned. So I applied to schools looking exclusively at printmaking programs and looking for the best setup sort of print studio that I could find. I applied with a portfolio that had, dry point and mezzotint in it coming out of high school. I had done etchings and...
Yeah, so where did you end up going?
Ultimately, Massachusetts College of Art had one of the best print shops that I had seen. I loved that it was in an old gymnasium with every technique, adjacent to each other, which really lended itself to cross-process work, which I was definitely interested in. So the main thing that coming from an internship apprentice position gave me was I knew that I loved the work, that I knew that I loved the collaborating that the printer and artists were doing. I loved the problem solving aspects of it. I loved that every day was different. Even as an intern, I didn't know walking in what I was going to be doing one day to the next. But, I approached everything trying to show that I could do more than that. So if it was sweeping, I would sweep every single corner and dust every baseboard. And, I was just going to do that until someone told me not to, because that was the kind of thoroughness that I was hoping, that might take notice. So
you touched on it a little bit, but you have your own practice, but you also are a collaborative printer as well. I'd love to hear you talk about that, and specifically kind of about that balance, because I feel like I hear these discussions that some people are saying, as a collaborative printer, you don't need to be an artist, or I'm a collaborative printer, I'm not an artist, I'm more of a technician. And where, for you personally, where does that kind of fit?
So I've always put in any of my information about myself that I was pursuing a career as an artist and a collaborative printer. Those were never in conflict for me. But, you ask people sort of like, thinking about their dream scenario as far as making their work, some people really would love to be like in a cave, in a castle, whatever, left alone with their work 90% of the time. And I was just never that person. The work that I make is so fueled by my relationships, my interactions with other people. So the environment of a print studio, the sort of collaborative space, was deeply nourishing to my own practice. And I also always thought that, that today this is a problem I'm trying to solve for you, but tomorrow it's going to be my problem. If I can't work through this for you, how am I going to work through this for my own work? And in some ways, we give ourselves so much more liberty with our own work if we get 3/4 of the way there and then think, this is a nightmare, let me just paste this on after. We can find another solution. But when you work with an artist, the demands are much higher. You really, you don't get to make the decision that maybe this is too hard. That's their decision. So I love that it really was more demanding of my craft as well. Having seen going into it that there was a whole art to it and a way of communicating about it, that was definitely very impactful. But the ways that it came into my education was in the form of, taking on TA-ships. I was always in the studio. I work on my own work only when it's really quiet, late at night when no one's there. So it would mean that any of the hours I was putting in the studio, I kind of was half just focusing on what else was going on, easily distracted.
Oh, yeah.
So if someone had an interesting problem that was happening or a litho emergency, I was usually the one that was around and was very happy to put off my own work for a little longer while I took on some interesting problem for the next 2 hours that I probably should have been, working on some drawing I was putting off. So those all sort of fed into my collaborative work. But there's sort of in my whole career path and a project I'm still working on that was hugely influential was an early collaboration with an artist, Emily Lombardo. And I went to Mass Art. Across the street from Mass Art was the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. So Emily Lombardo was in the MFA program at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. But we actually met in the year I had already been graduated, and I was working at a cafe and she worked at the bar across the street. So naturally we saw each other twice a day.
Right, of course.
Before her shift and after mine, we saw each other a lot. And it wasn't until, I heard her having some challenges with the person that was assisting her as a printmaking helper, that I was like, Emily, do you know what I do? And she said, oh, I thought you were a photographer. I was like, no, Emily, I'm a printmaker. I've been doing this since I was 14. Like, what are you working on? And what she was working on was a series called The Capricios, which was a queer feminist take on Goya's Los Capricios, started from the very beginning and doing all 80 of the Capricios. So she reimagined all of them and really extended the satire into a contemporary perspective. She was working on that for her thesis show and had made 40 plates, and she was like, I can't print them all. I was like, this is the opposite problem of like every other printmaker. I was like, usually we're swimming in prints and not making more plates than we can print. So I started working with her, and within a year, the Child's Gallery saw the project. They're an old print dealer in Boston who was starting to show more contemporary work and was interested in publishing it. So, I immediately thought there's only one place I could possibly conduct a project like that. I couldn't really do that in a student shop. So I approached the CCP about bringing the project back home. So I moved back to Connecticut with 80 etching plates and started editioning them. And so we've worked sort of in sets since it takes so long to print one series of 80 plates. And they're very particular. They have like a mirror finished bevel, rounded edge, and about a solid inch of border around the plate, which the artist wanted a very contemporary look to it.
Right.
So they're printed with like a blind embossment around the edge of the etching. So each plate just has to be fastidiously wiped, and then the whites just polished completely white with no plate tone. And there's text in the bottom, so you also can't just solvent
Right.
the whole borders out. So they've always been a labor-intensive project, and so we've been working on it for a while. But it was incredible. I mean, talk about your 100,000 hours
Yeah.
working. It just meant
Yeah.
right off the bat, I had 1,700 prints to make.
And it's ongoing? Did you say you're still in the
It's
process of
it's it's
printing it?
ongoing.
Uh-huh.
Yes, we're still printing it, but we unveiled it at IFPDA Fair in 2016, I think, which was the election year because they're very political and there's some
Yeah.
fascinating plates in it, including, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And I was so aware as I was working on them that I was like, oh, this history is still being written. We don't know the half of what these images are going to mean to people looking back, which,
Mm.
carries a little bit of Goy's originals as well. There's some elements that are so timeless and other ones that are really kind of mystifying to us. But there was always a consistent narrative, like the hobgoblins, like, each character represented a class of society and had a lot of connotations. And while some of that's lost to us now, at least, to the average viewer, the elements of human nature are very apparent.
Right.
And those took on a little bit of an ominous significance shortly after the election as we sort of saw what happened. But it was unveiled right before it, and we were able to hang all 80 of them on one wall, which was the first time I ever saw that
Oh,
in front of
wow.
me. So it's a lot
That
of
must
work.
have been incredible to see them all up like that.
Yeah, I remember seeing the disasters of war
Uh-huh.
at the Yale University Art Gallery, and at the time walking down the wall to the place that I had fully auditioned up to, just looking down the wall to my left and my right and seeing how much was ahead of me and how much was behind me was certainly a moment getting. But then we switched up how we were doing them. Initially, we were releasing them in volumes of 15 plates, and then we started to just produce sets of the entire
Yeah.
edition, the entire 80,
Hmm.
which was much more sort of how collecting institutions were interested in it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we've already placed a couple of those, which is exciting. And one set was shown alongside Goya's entire Capriccios, another museum who had the entire set. So that
Oh,
was very,
that's
very
so
cool to see those
cool. That's so
installation shots of
cool.
that as well. So that was my first contract job that I took on myself as the sole printer on. But it brought me back to CCP, and it was in a point of a lot big transition. The master printer that I had worked under was no longer there, sort of just as I was coming back. And so there was a bit of a void as far as there's a lot of work to be done. And
Yeah.
so shortly after starting on the project part-time, I moved to full-time and started on as studio manager. And well, I started on first as the associate printer and then later took on the studio managing as well. But it was a process of really sort of trial by fire, working with artists right out of school, using every trick and favor I had to sort of work my way through each project because there's such a gap between doing it for yourself and doing it for another artist. So, and at the time I graduated just before turning 21, so I was very young. So I was coming back. So I was
Yeah.
22 and working with artists as a collaborating printer, and then I've still been doing that for the last 5 years. So
Yeah.
I've got to definitely see a lot of growth for myself in that time. And looking back, it's just so cool to see all the different projects that's come through the door in that time.
Yeah, what an incredible experience to just kind of you got thrown in the deep end, but it was like
Yeah.
the pool that you'd practiced in.
And a really
Yeah.
unique environment. The Center for Contemporary Printmaking is a arts nonprofit. So we have a print gallery, artist members who rent studio time. We have workshops, and we also have contract printing and collaborative bookings. So I'm one of two full-time, three printers total, with Chris Shore and Megan Morrow are my two coworkers there.
Mm.
So, you're not alone in it, but we're also in part an educational facility. So there's a sort of different flavor to some of the work that we do, since it's not solely publishing production oriented.
Hmm.
The studios are shared with artist members. So it's always maintaining kind of an educational role. So even while we're working on other projects, people are coming through the door just to see the galleries, to look at the studios. They might be working in the spaces. They might be working on their own projects. There's a lot of balls in the air when you're working on a project. It's not one of those sort of sterile print shops where you're able to close the door and, work
Yeah.
on just a single project for several weeks at a time, and then that's over.
I feel like that's a wonderful introduction and overview for your collaborative practice.
Yeah,
I'd love to talk to you about your personal practice as well.
absolutely. So, I mean, my technique wise, my two loves have mostly been etching and intaglio, and then litho have been equally engaging. My personal work has definitely been heavily influenced from growing up with a photographer in the family. Certain elements of just the aesthetic, the placement on the page. My father shot black and white, square photographs. He sanded out the edge of the negative carrier, so there's always a black line around it. There was
Huh.
always, a very formal look to them. And so my work, I think, really took on that in some formal elements of drawing, working with some color, but predominantly in black and white, starting with this observational eye that I think I learned from photography. I still use my iPhone camera as my sort of visual sketchbook,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm constantly photographing. I have a 80 plus thousand photo archive that covers the last decade. And then my work generally is created drawing observationally from those photographs. The photography lens and honesty, I've always found that there's someone shows a side of themselves in a sort of a 16th of a second, that in a longer setting, there's so much more ability to kind of control certain aspects of how you look, and it's impossible to not influence what's happening if you're there drawing it from life. That becomes this editing process where what you're looking at never existed. There was no point in time when every element lined up just the way it is. Maybe it's done over 3 days. Maybe, model's always moving. You're making constant decisions from observation, but with this eye of an editor. Using photography for me was about capturing, I think it's Roy Decarava that talked about the decisive moment. And, that there's a split second that if you're looking for it, if you stay sensitive and open, there's these really honest moments around you all the time. And sometimes it's just about making yourself a little bit invisible and sensitive as an observer to not overpower that. And there's something about using even an informal camera like a phone that doesn't interrupt things as much. And maybe it's terrible that people are so used to seeing me holding my phone, but so that archive forms the sketchbook in a lot of ways, which I pore over and look and sort of, I know when an image strikes me, and a lot of times there's a sense that it already feels like my work. It feels like I've already made it, and I go, oh, this is, either I have that experience in the moment, or looking at the photograph and going, oh, this is the world that I live in. This is the world that I'm trying to capture, and that has so much to do with sort of elevating these moments of daily life, which I think are imbued with something really powerful, very human, that something very sensitive about something that's so familiar that they're not, they're mundane in some way, but they're also very relatable and they're honest. And, I have a lot of devotion for my subjects, and I try and sort of capture that. And so each step of the process of taking a photograph and moving from a photograph to a preparatory drawing that I usually do on a Mylar that I can keep erasing and things like that, and flip back and forth and keep looking at. So through a careful preparatory drawing, and then the transferring to the plate, and then the working on the plate, and then printing it, that each step of this I really approach in a devotional manner, where the labor that I'm putting into it, I hope creates a sensitivity for the subject that maybe the viewer would have, maybe the viewer wouldn't, but it changes how you look at it from if it were just sort of something immediate, if it was presented as a photograph, if it was just an image that you encountered, I think sometimes you would look right past them, but when you see what someone invested in them to bring this, in front of you, it changes how you approach it.
No, I think that's huge. Yeah, that people do instinctually, I think, even if they don't fully understand it, get the aura of something that's been treated with reverence, and the way that a snapshot on a phone, even if it's, you know, a interesting image, we're so used to seeing it. We're so image saturated with even candid moments, because photography is so omnipresent, that transferring that with purpose to and to to paper really, I think, is part of what gives your work the aura that it has.
And the next step of that was, you know, being able to do that. So I always felt very connected to representational work and the history of that as a queer person, as a queer artist, and typically depicting, you know, my intimate relationships and the closeness to the subject matter that I have. I needed to sort of be able to approach that, and I wanted to elevate that. I wanted to see it in the way that you got to see a 17th century aristocrat. I wanted to see that craft applied to the subject, to have access to it. I felt like I was somehow left out a little bit from work which, in presenting itself visually as anti-establishment, really also rejected any elements that were sort of academic as well. That sort of to give a raw credit to the, you know, to the authenticity of the work, they did that through just expressing it with the tools that, you know, someone might have. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that, but I wasn't seeing the full range in that. So work that was political, work that was critical, relied so much on expediency and the ability of someone coming to it. And then there was this work that was reserved for, you know, people with access to training and academic background, and they got to be depicted in one way. And sort of everyone else had these other options, but not the same one. And so that felt imbalanced to me, and it was something that I was trying to sort of like address through my work, to get to see the subjects that I wanted to depict, the moments from my life, approached with that same reverence. So after studying at Massachusetts College of Art, I actually took 6 months of drawing instruction at the Boston Realist Academy. That's like a French academic drawing school, and learned that there's, you know, a whole craft. And I kind of grew up hearing that anyone could learn to draw, but the operative word there is learn.
Yeah.
You actually have to be taught that. And seeing a school devoted just to teaching that, you know, I realized it was the most practical things that I never thought to ask. Like, you know, I walked in and I saw how they sharpened their pencils, which is like 6 inches of lead coming out of a wooden pencil, and then you sharpened the lead. So you could always make a mark that no mark you ever made would ever, like, you couldn't erase the marks you build in strength of mark making as you build in confidence with where something is.
Yeah.
So you start really spidery and very, very light, and you control your hand through drawing with a 6-inch lead pencil, which the first couple times you break one and you're just like, well, shit. And you'd be sitting in the you know, figure drawing class, and you just hear this like pin drop clink noise, and you're just like, oh no, someone broke a lead. And realizing the speed also is so different coming out of school, where you're always on a deadline of, you know, maybe 2 weeks is the most you have for a project. And in my first 6 months there, you know, I did a 14-week figure pose, and I was coming once a week, and half the people there came 2 or 3 times a week to the same pose, you know?
Yeah.
So realizing that drawing that I thought someone was just so good that they made this angelic drawing took an amount of work that I just hadn't conceived of to put into it. And realizing that was sometimes what it took, and in time that might become quicker. But your first couple barg drawings, you're copying drawings of usually marble casts. So you start out copying a 2-dimensional form. And in the Drawing Academy, all of the beginning of it is, you know, learning drawing skills, which form the basis of painting. But for a printmaker, it was kind of amazing because I got to absorb all of that. And, you know, I wasn't really interested in the indirect oil painting. I kind of took that process and that sense of visual analysis that I had learned, and I just added it to the years that I was continuing to work representationally, even though that wasn't much of what was going on at the time in the program.
Hearing you say that, it kind of makes, from what I've seen of your work, kind of click. And elements of it that I think I've engaged with kind of intuitively. It's sort of like, okay, that's why. Because there's just this incredible kind of delicate tenderness in some of the images that you make of these little bit fleeting or passing moments, and it does have that elevating quality to it. And there's one that I was thinking of particularly that I think encompasses a lot of what you were speaking of, which came to mind, which is your piece that's called Ritual.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk to that piece? Because I feel like it's a good example of all of these elements coming together.
No, I think that was a really significant piece. It was the first etching that I finished out of school. I started working on it the last summer studio that I rented in Boston, and then coming back to CCP to finish it. And the image is one that actually my boyfriend had taken, which was a little bit of a departure because I was in it, but it ticked all the boxes of the second that I saw it. I was like, oh, this is part of my work. This looks already like it belongs in the body of work I've been making. And so responding to it right away sort of put it in that place. And it's one that I'm putting my lipstick on one of my best friends. We were just getting dressed to go out, and, he's wearing my silk blouse. And I wear lipstick every day. And it was something that really, talking about things that clicked for me, it was when I put it on for the first time, it clicked. The first time that I put on a shade of lipstick, that was like a classic, like red, and put on and I walked out, and I just like saw the impact that it had. And I went, this symbolizes something, and it made me feel really, really seen in a way that just sort of waking up unadorned in any way didn't necessarily feel as much as me as I did presenting more femme. And that's something that's sort of critical to that identity, that this is a chosen element, that it's not the sort of obligatory aspects of femininity that you're sort of pushed into, but something that, you really make a conscious choice towards. And so it's significant for me on that level. And then in this moment, so getting back to the piece Ritual, in this moment before we were going out, asked me to do his lipstick, and he just like floated down onto one knee in this like completely elegant, angelic gesture, looking up at me, and my face is turned down and the light's coming from behind me, so it's shadowed in this sort of like dark figure where I'm bestowing that onto him. And in this moment that really summed up so much about like queerness in the community and like these aspects that are so important to us, and seeing my profile, it touched on all of these things. My mother's family's Jewish, there's my full profile, and it just felt like this very religious sensibility to it, but was this sort of like queer baptismal moment. And so that image really struck me, and then I worked on it. It's a sort of fairly large-ish format, like 17 by 26 inch copper plate. Worked on it over, at least a dozen proofs, and translating this type of drawing that I was learning and the same steps that I had gone through of identifying the shadow line, suggesting it through the spit bite, and then building darker tones on and using China pencil and dry point and different types of stop out and things like that to build up the image. And then sort of finally getting it to the place where it felt like it sort of carried all of that. But it's been a great piece to have because it sort of crammed a lot of that into it.
It's so well named too, because that kind of passing of secret knowledge, the secret feminine knowledge, right? It's so ancient. It's in human DNA so far back, and it also is such a deep sort of bonding. I didn't really grow up with any particularly feminine female friends. Like I didn't really have that basically. When I come across it every now and then in my adult life, I'm so touched by it that it's so moving. Like I just was like at a wedding a few weeks ago, and I didn't know anyone besides the bride, and I was an attendant, and I hadn't painted my toenails, and I was wearing open-toed shoes, and I asked, does anyone have any nail polish? And someone was like, oh, I have some. And I was like, okay, great, thanks. And I went to take it from her, and she just was like, oh, I'll put it on you.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
we best friends now? Like
And you
it's,
are, and you are in that moment, like, they could be a complete stranger, and
yeah.
there's so much, and I've seen how much it's changed through these years. My identity has also evolved in how I think of it and how I understand that. And those elements of my presentation became more and more crucial to who I was in a way that I, in the beginning, just viewed it as sort of broadening the scope of masculinity. And then
Mm-hmm.
in time, while that was an important conversation for me to have, and I think that there was something significant about that, but in time, that felt less and less accurate and less honest because it wasn't like a political statement. It was like, I mean, it was,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't stop doing it if the politics changed.
Yeah.
I could be somewhere completely different and that might not be important at all. Or, sort of that same question. You're like, oh, if you're the last person, or if tomorrow you woke up and you had to get dressed for the next eternity, like
Uh-huh.
what would you put on? And there was
Yeah.
no sense that I'd be like, oh, if I have to wear this forever, I wouldn't look like myself. This was like completely, totally beyond skin deep. Um,
Yeah.
and so that really changed how I thought about my own gender to sort of just recently changing how I name that and understanding that as a non-binary experience and an aspect of a trans identity that is really important to me. But it's so layered with what you're talking about because I started to see how much my presence shifted in how people engaged with me,
Mm-hmm.
this sort of sisterhood that even the piece is about. Because it was very funny just being two visibly queer people would think that they understood that we were
Mm.
together,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and the response was always like, no, 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 Webster's my sister. Like, these are like, this is not the relationship. And sometimes from the outside, people just really had no
Yeah.
context for
Mm-mm.
seeing that, to see that bond and the power that had as two people sort of embracing something feminine about them. And then in the world at large, when I have that moment with someone and you just know that like you're sharing this moment of sisterhood with someone who in that moment, you would do anything for them. That if they were in trouble,
Oh,
if
yeah.
they needed something, you would follow them home, you would walk them
Oh,
somewhere.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
if they feel like they could trust you and show you that like, that's so powerful. That's this, and it was a total different world that when I felt like I had access to that, I was really privileged. I felt like I was being led into something.
Yeah. Well, I think there's such an interesting and fluid space between this like sort of gender as performance, right? So this idea of
Yeah.
like the other and how do I want to be perceived? And then that idea, I love what you said that like, if you were dressing this way for eternity or if you were the last human being on earth,
Yeah.
if no one's seeing this
Yeah.
red
Yeah.
lipstick or this hair or
Yeah.
whatever it is besides you. And I think that a lot of people get kind of tripped up in that and like in the
Hmm.
weeds in it in a
Hmm.
way that is just not necessary because it is
Hmm.
so much more in a gray area,
Yeah.
that it doesn't, it can be, I choose to present this way for me and for you, and I can,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
doesn't need to have this kind of
Yeah.
distinction.
And there's
Yeah.
definitely a trap of authenticity in that, where like you're like, oh, if you wouldn't do this every day forever, then it's not you. And the reality is, no, we absolutely live in a very complicated world.
Yeah.
And I feel deeply privileged that like I'm in a space and have a sense of safety in my daily life that I can move
Mm-hmm.
through the world this way. But every other headline and looking at the work shared by other femmes, specifically non-binary femme people of color and trans women, presenting along the same spectrum, absolutely in a similar way, but experiencing absolute violence every day for that, and
Yeah.
either choosing to go out this way is coming at a great cost to their safety and well-being. So it's never to make it about like, oh, this like authenticity test of doing it every day or something like that, and that comes up a lot with like visibility and things like that, where you're like, well, it's this double-edged sword where you're more visible, but that can be a target. But
Mm-hmm.
like, I also don't shy away from it at all, that my experience of it has been so different, and it's really given me a lens to view that privilege, because it isn't, I see reflected constantly, that I have experiences that are very different from other people in a similar sharing a similar experience. And so, looking to make space for both of those and hoping that, in time, the conversation that I can have through my work and the platform that it can create can continue to work on those sort of topics, even while at times there's always that risk of being like, well, do you make it too subtle? Do you make it too on the nose? Do you, do you step outside your experience and risk it feeling inauthentic, or do you make only within your experience, and then are you addressing everything that you'd hope to in your work? And so I've definitely shifted towards just at least an understanding of like it as a body of work, as the meaning of each image is sequential and narrative and builds over time so that they're not in isolation. And that's how we consume images now.
Right.
Like you're saying, we're super saturated with them. So someone can see my entire body of work, and, not each image needs to go out there to try and tackle, every challenge or every identity or anyone who might share this. But I hope that being honest and authentic in sharing what my experiences are, that people who have similar ones or don't but find that they're surprised at how much they share in that is something that sort of has been important to me.
That's significant when any work, I think, is being made about, anyone outside of, the human gold standard of the straight white male, like straight white cis male, right? Is that it, I think the work often is, and again, I think this is something that gets lost a little bit, is that it can be about the inherent otherness at the same time it is about the inherent humanness. And so it's I'm doing this ritual, let's say, that you are going to see. You're going to see this in your own way, and maybe you're going to say, oh, like, I see my wife and daughter doing that. Or you're going to say like, oh, I do that with my sister.
Yeah.
But you're also good, but it also can be a statement of, this is who I am, as the artist saying, but this is also how I exist as well, which is different from you, but also the same. And that's part of what makes, I think, work about identities really uniquely beautiful, is because they can exist in that space.
And something that I've definitely looked to share, and at least sort of to be generous in my own experience with, is that early in my work, some of the images that I was responding to had a lot to do with watching one partner struggle through his coming out process, his accessing transition-related services, and presenting in the way that he needed to be seen in the world. But what I kept finding over and over again is that the steps taken were so common, and you had, I think, mentioned the performative aspects of gender earlier, that what I saw over and over again, and I focused on in my sort of earlier work, were moments like haircuts. Like there's a piece, Buzzing, that's a 30 by 40 silk aquatint. So it's a fairly large print, and the process gives it a sort of really deep velvety black. But the image is of my partner shaving his head in the bathroom sink, which got at so many little moments in it, because on one hand, we make a lot of decisions every day about, our hair, our presentation. Every time we get a haircut, such an important aspect of our identity that we make a decision on constantly, on to either maintain or sort of reaffirm or change. And also frequently that's accessed in really gendered ways, where, when I had a short haircut, trying to convince the hairdressers to leave the little sort of pixie length bits above my ear, which they would just cut off over and over again. They just, it didn't matter what I'd said. They sort of just snipped them off because that was not the haircut that I was supposed to be getting.
Right.
So these little gendered aspects would come out over and over again. The barbershop, being a very male-dominated space, and so it was a challenging environment to sort of access something that you need on every week or two. So, and I don't cut hair, and all I would end up doing in these moments is photographing, kind of powerless to help, but also as an observer or a voyeur and watching these sort of contortions that he would go through to shave the back of his head in a mirror, which were always just like, fascinating for me on a formal, figurative basis, but also that they're critical moments of identity creation. And also ones that were so relatable. So there's that one. There's another one where he's picking his clothes out in the morning, and I just like was always waking up in bed and kind of like staring dreamily up at him, backlit, picking out his clothes. But being like, this is something everyone does. This isn't, I'm not sharing something that's, so different. That's about, only other trans people have in common, but something that everybody is going through with their gender, but they are allowed to view it as something invisible or something rote, and sort of prescribed that queer people don't have that roadmap for. So everything's intentional, how many partners you have, what you call them, who you're committed to in what ways, how you look, how you present yourself. All of these are things that over and over again, we don't have a roadmap for, so we're kind of making up as we go.
And I wonder if that kind of ties back into the question we were fooling around with a little bit earlier before we started recording about communication in queer communities and how there is a shared language that, at least I recognize, across the States. It is very self-observant and understanding, and maybe because, as you say, there's not a roadmap. Like you don't grow up seeing movies, every single movie ever made, which is about two straight people getting together. Like you don't have anything. Like you don't have the culture. It's not there. And so maybe that's part of like that communication is because without a roadmap, the need to find your way forward is so inherent and important, and the only access is other queer people, because you don't have a playbook, something like that.
Even you're talking about the communication and the language, each element of that is also deliberate, and something that, often is fought for in different ways. So I think there's a lot of awareness of that, and also awareness, especially in terms of communication and then visual culture that's related to that. It's steeped in its own reservoir of sort of artists working and sharing work on the margins. And I think that photography was also sort of instrumental, because I saw more confessional ways of making images that were related to sort of like Nan Goldin and Mark Morris Rowe, having more connection in some ways to my process and the ways that I make images than, say, another studio artist or like a Lucian Freud or something like that. Even like maybe they're like getting at something that's kind of raw, kind of honest, but in very, very different ways. And that ability to capture something on the fly and something fleeting has a lot to do, I think, with this intimacy and codedness. And there's not really a lot of promise that you're like always, even like, let's say you meet out one night, that if you met the next day that you'd be looking the same way, that you would necessarily be in the same space of this moment, this exchange that's so, important, but also a little bit fleeting and a little bit fraught, maybe. So I think that way of making images and communicating visually through partially coded, partially overt ways is something that is important, and that I'm trying to, certainly not always succeeding, but looking to like give something to, that there's parts of my work that are overt and there's parts that are just more subtle, that maybe have a special significance to another queer viewer, but that there's a feeling that supersedes that, so that, people are able to connect for that split second with desire, with intimacy, with longing, before they ever connect another element of it, because they're having that experience with the subject, not what I'm thinking about necessarily who it is, but they have their own narrative. But the fineness, the detail of that line work, you're able to sort of communicates that. It's a very intuitive line that it sort of follows, that people can absorb and read.
In a way, the more finely rendered the actual bodies are, almost the more universal they become. Because when you see, you're going to have an intuitive reaction just from seeing something that's very, just the shape, the the gesture, the body language that's going on
Yeah.
before you start to kind of decode the social cues
Yeah. Yeah.
that might then
Yeah.
then may allow you to fix identity to the figures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had some really interesting responses. Man, there's so much to cover, but I was doing a residence in Germany near the Swiss-Austrian border in a town called Sigmaringen, and I was staying there. And one of the pieces I made this monotype of my partner Enoch, who's a performance artist, and their body is very much a part of their work and their narrative and their sort of artistic presence. When they had top surgery, they didn't have a nipple reconstruction in the process, so they just have two scars that run parallel across their chest. And what people attach to that, because there's several pieces that those scars are visible. And again, I talk a lot in their own thinking and writing about their own work, about healing and the way that a scar is representative of so much. So that type of surgery, which I had seen so few that I didn't actually realize that often it looks like a mastectomy scar from cancer. And so sometimes people were looking at these images and they were thinking, maybe this was my mother or something like that, which really made no sense in the context.
Right.
But at the same time, but I had no problem with, because I was like, wow, if I don't know that looks like a mastectomy scar, then why haven't I seen more mastectomy scars? In the same way that this person, of course, they wouldn't necessarily know inherently that this is a specific decision that my partner made when they were having their surgery, something that was so visual and significant, but sort of connected across very different identities, but on a very human, physical body, in a way that related so much to the body, and human processes of healing and things like that.
And again, that identity and the way we attribute that, what is male, what is female, and all of that. I mean, and that's an interesting, I think there'd be an interesting exploration there of kind of what exists in that space where of like having the choice versus not having the choice, right? Because that's it's a huge difference. But ending up
both being necessary for survival in their own way.
Exactly.
So, and that the, in the process of healing a scar, it's like, deeply related to the sort of trauma associated with it. And then a really powerful process of, stitching someone back together, mentally, emotionally, physically, and healing through that. So, I think that's another narrative that I sort of hope comes into the work, even though if you asked someone to necessarily pull all of that out of it, I don't know that they would have that, but it doesn't change how we respond when we see something really physical like that,
Yeah, and that human response, whether it's like empathy or wanting to care, or maybe, I think people sometimes have like a natural inborn, that kind of like pull back, almost fear sometimes of like, what happened to you?
Mirror, and also that mirror neuron response that's actually producing an echo of that, it shoots down your leg, you see that, and and it gives you a jolt that so much of sort of like a lot of human empathy is built on, that ability of our brains, that they've evolved the ability to see something that someone else is experiencing and experience a physical mimicry of it and understand something about what would happen, because it'd be impossible to learn if you had to touch the same stove that you just watched someone burn themselves on, to like know why they're yelling. You'd burn yourself a lot more.
And then all of those sort of, I think, social questions, that's like, why weren't you as familiar with a mastectomy scar? Mastectomies are so common, right? And why isn't this woman familiar with a top surgery scar? Top surgeries are so common, But again, it has to do with what we see, the communities we're in, what we associate being appropriate to show, It's all really interesting.
But I've always driven towards, anytime I saw an image that I'd created or that was like sort of, some moment, when I got the sense that I was like, I don't think I've seen this before. I haven't seen this image before. And, we've got millennia of like, all the entire like human history of like image making. We have such a visual saturation of digital culture now. So any image that I haven't seen, I'm like, oh, there's a reason. There's a social pressure for this
Yeah.
image to not come across my gaze, whether it exists and I haven't seen it, it doesn't exist, which is probably rare, but more often it's just that this is not being sort of allowed into public space, and even, down to the Facebook algorithms censoring
Right.
some binary gendered sense of what is a, female presenting nipple,
Right.
um, which is an absurd term to begin with. It's a
Yeah,
nipple. It
I
doesn't have
know.
a gender identity. But yeah, that these are very real, very programmed ways that we're limiting the number of images that we're, the types of images that we're able to see. And so that visual artists have a way to kind of push back against that, because we're, our life is the images we make.
Yeah, yeah, and visual artists are the creators of visual culture. Kind of going back to this idea of what we're sort of allowed to see and what we're not, or what we're shown and what we're not. One of the things that I think about when I look at your work is this idea of like tenderness as protest in its own way, because it's so against the masculine narrative, which is the narrative that we get. and that to show vulnerability, to show intimacy, is in and of itself an act of resistance to what we're supposed to value, which is strength, independence, knocking each other down, competition, all of those toxic masculinity, capitalistic values that is what we're born into. So I guess I wonder if you ever think about your work in those terms, or if you have just kind of thoughts in general of that idea of resisting through gentleness or tenderness. Yeah.
I mean, I think that really pretty much sums up what I try and do with my artwork in general. I mean, there's something that I wrote for my artist statement, and the first line of it, which I sort of used a lot to try and sum up some ideas about that, just starts that within the defiant halo of an embrace, there exists a tenderness so powerful it overwhelms the coded markers of otherness around us. And the idea really sitting right in there about using that and really feeling like, again, like what I talked about, like what I have to bring, like, the air sign thing. I don't bring the real fiery energy to the work that I do, but it doesn't mean any less to me. And I think that honestly, there's so much more strength that sits underneath that.
Yeah.
And you find that all around you. You find that in mothership, in the way that we're talking about that people protect each other, that they like work through just some of the most difficult things imaginable with so much care, with so much tenderness. And the people that you kind of come to in your life that you think of as the strongest are the ones that have really been able to do all that, and on top of it not become bitter, which seems like so much. And then when you encounter bitterness, you go, oh, this is also an expression of really having been through something and being really vulnerable. Like, I see it in that bitterness as well. So it's not that that's like, oh, that's a sign of weakness, but it's just that like you see that this is something fragile and worth protecting, and that there's not that much more, I would hope to do. But it's also funny in the sort of way that you just framed it. In a very literal way, I had the wonderful opportunity just last weekend to lead a workshop at the Goethe Institute, which is a German language bridge in New York City, focused on sort of teaching language to people who might one day pursue citizenship or something like that. But they had an exhibition curated by the Schule Museum, one of only a couple of museums in the whole world solely dedicated to the art and history of LGBT people. And they have a whole archive of that in Germany. So on behalf of Stonewall 50, the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, which is happening, right now, this month is Pride Month, and it's the 50th anniversary of that, I was asked to be one of two artists who presented a youth workshop to students to try and bring that narrative around and update it because the exhibition is going to travel all over the world, from like literally Dubai to Helsinki, and like very different cultural contexts, to try and explain the history of the LGBT movement, especially in America, and as told through this German visual culture that was curated for the show. And we ended up approaching it via collage and allowed the students to take these copies of the work and just cut them up and recontextualize them into their own work. And then I introduced like using rubelith as an overlay film and citrusolve transfers and some other processes that sort of come from a printmaking perspective. But the work that I made while I was in the workshop with them to talk about, what perspective I brought to it, ended up taking all of the pieces where people were holding protest signs, which were also in German that I don't read, and replacing the image in the sign with the moments in which there were queer people touching from the other artworks. And so it was just, maybe a much more literal version of it that I wouldn't have made if I wasn't, doing collage with a group of high schoolers. But it was also sweet to just sort of think about this visual narrative of what I'm kind of like trying to stamp my feet about in my work, which is just that intimacy is political, that sharing our personal lives is political, and that there's never going to be a point where talking about those stories is going to get less necessary, because whether or not the context that it's in changes so much over time. And you see that in the work that was presented. And when I did the residence in Germany, I was asked a lot about my identity as a Jewish person, which growing up in the Northeast is like part of it. My grandmother survived the Holocaust, and so it's been a part of my identity for a long time. But does it affect me on a daily basis? Not at all, in the way that, being a visibly queer person, it influences every sort of interaction that I have. And so I was going to Germany and talking to people who had never met a Jewish person, because it's so isolated in the South there, and there's so few people that came back, but conveying a narrative that had to do with my experience as a queer person in America, but also identified a relationship between them. And another piece that I shared for the youth workshop involved being situated in a room in the artist in residence that was a converted, it was a beautiful old cedar room, but it had once been army barracks. And it was 2 weeks into the residence that I looked above my bed and saw that in the old beam, there was still a swastika carved into it. Oh. And it was the first time I was just so struck by seeing this original record that had nothing to do with, some little shit teenagers, but knowing that this was, in the heart of Nazi territory in Germany was so different, and knowing immediately that I wanted to do something about it, but I also felt such an urge to document it and sort of, for there to be a process around it existing. And so I ended up making this piece that was made up of 7 long pink strips of paper that had like a frottage, a rubbing of the swastika on it, and each rubbing I sanded 50 strokes of sandpaper, and slowly the swastika disappears. And my initial gut had been I wanted to just like carve a triangle into it so badly, but I didn't want to like make the symbols sharing a equivalency that like for the next 100 years, whatever, there, as long as this building's here, that like that exists. But I was so much more struck by the ability of one symbol to erase another and to like rewrite that narrative. So the last panel of it is just a small upside down triangle of the black sandpaper that's still embedded with the sawdust from the sanding. Stuck on it. And it was sort of one, it carries with it, the physical residue of it, and two, really spoke to the ability of, symbols to erase and change, and by, this delicate, slow process, just erode a really hateful, history embedded in a visual culture. So there was something that I got to bring and physically show the students, collage workshop, where we were talking about a lot of symbolism, and then also had as part of the culmination of my residency there to talk about, overlapping identities and, have some sort of accountability
Yeah.
process for that as well.
Yeah, and just that act of like the 50 strokes of the sandpaper like is so gentle. Well, you will have to keep all of us up to date on what you're doing. Where can people find you and follow you and learn more about your work?
So my Instagram is at sayyoudo, which is SAYYOUDO. My website is paulderuvo.com. You can find my portfolio and projects there.
Excellent. Well, I will definitely put all of that in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on. I'm so glad we got to have this chat.
Absolutely. And I definitely plan on sharing of my process during the residency. And I've been loving using my stories to give little windows into everything from my experiment steel facing stuff and other areas that I've been doing research into. So definitely stay tuned for updates there.
Wonderful. Well, we will definitely be in touch. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Ciao.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again in 2 weeks' time when my guest will be Ben Munoz. We talk about his incredible undertaking of creating 6 woodcuts 8 feet high by 4 feet wide, all which chronicle his family's history of immigrating to the United States from Mexico, beginning with his grandfather all the way through to Ben's own 2 daughters. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help from Timothy Pauschak, and music, new, remastered, sexed up, and incredible music by Joshua Weber. You're the very best, Weber. I'll see you in 2 weeks.